Are you normal? No, I'm not talking about your personality. I am talking about your glucose levels. Now, a lot of people will tell you that it is dangerous for diabetics to aim for normal glucose levels. So we're going to look at that in this video. On today's video, we're going to look at several questions, including, what is normal glucose? What is a normal glucose rise after a meal? Is it dangerous or wise for diabetics to aim for normal glucose? And finally, are there benefits to achieving normal glucose? Let's start with the idea of what is it that makes a diabetic a diabetic. In the eyes of doctors, it is your glucose levels. In America, if your A1C is 6.5 or higher, or your fasting glucose is consistently at 126 milligrams per deciliter or higher, you are a diabetic. Now, to people who don't know much about diabetes, those numbers are, well, they're just numbers. They don't mean much. Why should I care whether I have a 5 or an 8 or a 12 on my A1C results? The answer is that one thing everybody agrees with is that if your numbers are too high, that is, if your glucose levels are consistently high, you are hurting yourself. You're destroying your health, and terrible consequences are probably ahead for you. You could end up getting your legs cut off, having kidney failure, losing your eyesight, having a heart attack or a stroke, or even getting cancer or dementia. Too much sugar floating around in your bloodstream day after day and year after year is incredibly dangerous, even if it may take years before you see any bad results. But most of these terrible diabetic afflictions do not typically happen to people with normal blood sugar and no insulin resistance. They keep their eyes, they keep their legs, their kidneys function well all their lives. They go into their 80s and 90s without heart attacks or strokes. And since this is typically true, we really need to discover what are normal glucose levels and whether it's possible for those who have crossed that terrible line into diabetes to ever get back to the normal level. Because if it is possible, if there is a chance we can safely move back to normal glucose, we ought to make every possible effort to get there by whatever means we can. Well, first let's look at normal glucose. What would a person's blood sugar be if they not only didn't have diabetes, but they weren't even pre-diabetic or even close to being pre-diabetic? What is normal glucose? A couple of doctors, Casey Means and Chimene Richa, reviewed some of the recent studies done on general populations in various parts of the world that tested thousands of subjects with continual glucose monitors in order to determine what normal glucose looks like. After analyzing the findings, they made these conclusions. A non-diabetic, healthy individual can expect 1. Fasting glucose levels between 80 to 86 milligrams per deciliter. 2. They will have glucose levels between 70 and 120 for approximately 90% of the day, and they'll rarely go above 140 or below 60. 3. 24-hour mean glucose levels of around 89 to 104. 4. Mean daytime glucose of 83 to 106. 5. Mean nighttime glucose of 81 to 102. 6. Time to their post-meal glucose peak will be around 46 minutes to 1 hour. Now, Dr. Richard Bernstein tells an interesting story about when he was a young doctor and had frequent visits from glucose meter salesmen. They'd want to demonstrate their meter on him. He would instead have them test themselves. And he says the most common number that kept coming up from the blood sugar tests on these young salesmen was 83. In fact, it came up so frequently, it seemed almost uncanny. These young men nearly always had blood glucose in the 80s, and usually it was in the mid-80s or lower 80s. He concluded that blood sugar of around 83 was normal. Before that, he was keeping his own glucose at around 100 because he'd heard that was normal. But after seeing this, he started keeping his glucose in the mid to low 80s with an A1C of around 4.5, and he still does that to this very day, even though he's in his late 80s. Later, Dr. Bernstein was curious why so many doctors and diabetes experts recommended such high A1Cs and glucose levels, often advocating for an A1C of 7 or even higher. He asked several of the big-shot doctors that had been involved in the process of the ADA encouraging diabetics to aim for such high levels of sugar in their blood. Bernstein tells how that their answer was nearly always something like this. They would say, I specialize in diabetes. I have 2,000 to 3,000 patients, and they're all diabetics. If they go blind or suffer kidney failure or their legs are amputated or they get congestive heart failure, well, those are all natural consequences of the disease. But if one person out of 2,000 dies of hypoglycemia, I'll get sued. So I'm not going to allow my patients to be anywhere near normal blood sugar because the risk of hypoglycemia becomes too great. I'd rather them have blood sugar 2 or 3 or 4 times what a normal blood sugar would be. The answer to our first question, what is normal glucose, is a fasting glucose in the mid-80s and an A1C somewhere between the mid-4s to the upper 4s. Our second question is, what is normal glucose after a meal, after eating? And the answer to that would be somewhere between 120 to 130 milligrams per deciliter, which would be around 6.9 millimoles. And if you're serious about getting your glucose levels under control, you'll want to excel in 3 different areas. A good A1C of around 5.0 or lower, a fasting glucose somewhere in the 80s, preferably the mid-80s, and post-meal glucose peaks no higher than 130. Now, that would be the ideal. This would be near perfection, especially for someone with diabetic tendencies. And even if you don't quite hit those goals, the closer you can get to them, the better. But that brings us to the question that was our third question, which is it dangerous or is it wise for diabetics to aim for normal glucose? Now, we already heard from Dr. Bernstein on this, who feels that every diabetic and all diabetics should indeed aim for normal glucose. And he suggests that many doctors who encourage you to shoot for an A1C of 7 are just worried about lawsuits. Well, I won't quite agree completely that every doctor is worried about lawsuits, but I do believe that hypos, the phenomenon of your glucose falling just way too low, is on the minds of many, many doctors. Now, whether they're worried about lawsuits or just worried about their patients' well-being hardly matters. So we have to address the issue of hypos. The first thing I want to say is that normally hypos are primarily relevant to people who are on insulin or high-powered diabetic meds that force the pancreas to release a lot of insulin. If you're not taking insulin and you're not taking any meds, unless yours is an unusual situation, you probably will never have a hypo. High glucose will be your constant enemy, not low glucose. Now, I was an exception. While I was in my 40s, taking no insulin and no diabetic meds, I was having serious hypos. This was a condition called reactive hypoglycemia. My own pancreas was spewing out loads of insulin to combat carbs in my diet. And after having my glucose rise too high an hour or so after eating, it would then plunge way too low about 3 or 4 hours later. But when I changed to a low-carb diet, those hypos just totally disappeared. But many doctors who specialize in diabetes are often working with severe diabetics who are taking many units of insulin each day along with various diabetic meds. And if these patients determine to aim for normal glucose, and then they try to achieve this by giving themselves even more insulin and more, they could well get dangerous hypos and even die. So the idea of dangerous hypos for diabetics attempting to reach normal blood sugar is not without some basis in fact. If you're going to eat a big bowl of mac and cheese and have a huge chunk of bread and then a monstrous piece of chocolate cake with ice cream, but just before that you inject yourself with huge amounts of insulin, you are indeed asking for trouble, and you'll probably get it. That's not the way to achieve normal glucose levels. Or if you go to the doctor and say, "Doc, I need 3 times as much medication as I'm now taking. I want normal blood sugar, and I'm determined to get it. So write me out a prescription and triple all my meds and double my insulin. And I hope I'll be able to come back to you with a great A1C. Well, that's just stupid. It would not work, and it would prove dangerous. And if that's your conception of aiming for normal glucose, then you'd be better off to settle for an A1C of 7.5. Now, with that 7.5, you would be harming your body every day with the high glucose, but at least you wouldn't kill yourself with a hypo. But, of course, that's not what Dr. Bernstein recommends, not at all. He recommends taking small amounts of carbs at each meal, no more than 12 grams per meal, and then covering it with a small amount of pre-meal insulin, along with taking a mild, long-acting insulin. The other possibility for a dangerous hypo is if you're on insulin and meds and then keeping the same dosages, you suddenly switch cold turkey from a high-carb diet to a very low-carb diet. That really could spell trouble, and that's why whenever a diabetic who's on meds and or insulin switches from a standard diet to a keto diet, they really need to stay on top of their glucose levels to make sure they don't go too low. And they should inform their doctors of their plans and allow him to reduce their insulin and or meds if he or she sees fit. And this is why you'll always see that blue screen at the beginning of every one of my videos, which says that significant carbohydrate restriction will lower blood sugar levels and that dietary changes should be made under a doctor's care, and you should test yourself regularly. So, yes, there is a danger of hypos when you slash the carbs, although for most people, if you're not taking meds or insulin, the worst problem you're going to probably have will be the keto flu. But the alternative to say, well, I'm just not going to slash the carbs and I'm just going to allow myself to have high glucose, that alternative is terrible. That alternative means to keep right on eating high-carb trash, keep right on raising your glucose through the roof, keep right on damaging every organ in your body, keep on heading toward the land of amputations, kidney failure, erectile dysfunction, blindness, dementia, and gangrenous toes. Well, that's just not much of an alternative, is it? And that brings us to question number 4. Are there benefits to achieving normal or close to normal glucose? And the answer to that is a great big fat whopping yes. Let me say it again, yes. The problem with high glucose is that when it gets to a certain level, you're damaging your body. You're destroying your organs little by little every day. So the million-dollar question is, at what level does that destruction begin to occur? Is it 140, 180, 200? Where do we need to be in our glucose levels which will keep us safe? In Jenny Ruhl's excellent book, Blood Sugar 101, she reviews a lot of studies and concludes, the data we've reviewed so far seems to point to the range between 140 and 160 milligrams per deciliter as being where organ damage begins to occur, at least in people who are routinely spending a few hours each day with blood sugars in this range. So it seems safe to conclude that it is repeated exposure to blood sugars between 140 and 160 that make it more likely you will develop microvascular complications, retinopathy, neuropathy, and possible kidney damage. So, according to Jenny, if your glucose is above 140 or so for several hours every day, you're doing serious harm to yourself. And if that's true, what about people that wake up in the morning with fasting glucose of 200 or 300? How much more must they literally be destroying their own bodies? Jenny says this is probably why the American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists recommend that people with diabetes try to keep their glucose under 140 as much as possible. And then she says, sadly, the American Diabetes Association still tells people with diabetes that a blood sugar level of 180 2 hours after eating is, quote, tight control, unquote, and suggests that this level is all people with diabetes need strive for. She also quotes a research study where the researchers found that cholesterol, body size, cigarette smoking, and other factors, none of those things were highly accurate predictors of heart disease. She writes, blood sugar and blood sugar alone predicted whether or not a person was likely to have a heart attack. The risk of heart attack doubled for every 1% rise in A1C. Wow! Every time your A1C goes up another point, from 6 to 7, from 8 to 9, and so forth, you have just doubled your risk of heart attack. So clearly there are benefits to getting your glucose levels into the normal range. If only there was a way to do this without the risk of dangerous hypos and having our blood glucose bouncing up and down like a yo-yo. And of course, there is a way. When we cut the carbohydrates in our diet, and we're able, under our doctor's counsel, to reduce or eliminate our diabetic meds and insulin injections, and instead lower our glucose through diet, exercise, and getting proper sleep, we find that almost miraculously our glucose begins to drop. Our high blood pressure evaporates, and we know that we're no longer destroying our bodies with our lifestyle. Instead, we are preserving and rejuvenating them by eating natural and healthy foods and eliminating unnatural foods like chips, pretzels, candy, sugar-filled desserts, and so forth. And even though brown rice and potatoes can be said to be natural, most of us find they too have to go if we're ever to reach that promised land of normal glucose or even close to normal glucose. Now, some of you may be watching this video with a fasting glucose of 200 or 300 and you find all of this pretty depressing. You're saying, here you are talking about a fasting glucose in the 80s. I'd be happy just to see my fasting glucose dip under 200. But don't despair, my friend. Rome was not built in a day, and you didn't create your diabetes in a day either, and neither will you overcome it in a day. But you just might be surprised how quickly your glucose levels will respond once you take your diet seriously and begin to realize that the two most powerful tools to get close to your promised land are a very low-carb diet and time-restricted eating. Did you ever have a dinner consisting of 2 boiled eggs and a piece of cheese? How about trying that? Did you ever have a lunch consisting of a salad with low-carb vegetables and maybe a few macadamia nuts? No croutons, no toast, just a salad and a few nuts? You might be surprised how quickly your body will respond to your new diet and how quickly you will feel like a new you. And even if you can never quite get to the promised land of perfectly normal glucose, the closer you get, the better. An A1C of 5.9 is not ideal, but it's a whole lot better than 10.9. 6.2 is not perfect as an A1C, but you have reduced your chances of diabetic complications tremendously from the 12.5 A1C that you used to have. Remember that for every point your A1C rises, according to one study, your risk of heart disease doubles. But that means, conversely, that for every point you drop your A1C, your risk of heart attacks is cut in half. Do what you can, get as close to normal as you can, and you'll be the better for it. If you've recently been diagnosed with diabetes and you've just discovered this channel, let me recommend that you go to our Uploads page, which will give you access to every diabetic video we've posted since we began. As you work your way through all our videos, I believe you'll find the help you need. A link to our Uploads page is in the description.